everybody, I'm your instructor Jewel Flitcraft, and this is SOCH 377, Global Health Issues and Interventions. And in this course, we're going to look at a variety of global health issues. We're going to start with Chapter 1 and Chapter 5 for this week, where we're going to look at global health issues, policy, and healthcare delivery, as well as human trafficking, which is a huge problem within the global health community. So what is global health? You might be wondering when you signed up for this course what exactly that means. Global health is an area of study, research, and practice that places a priority on improving health and achieving equity and health for all people worldwide. So we're definitely going to be talking more than just about the United States, but we'll also do some comparisons between healthcare in the United States and other countries across the world. Global health is determined by problems, issues, and concerns that transcend national boundaries. So these are different things that affect more than just individual countries. Issues that impact one country may impact other countries across the world. So it's important to look at the idea of globalization. So as increasing connectedness and interdependence of humans within different countries, including the health of all on Earth happens, because many of us are traveling overseas either for work or for personal business or pleasure. Due to this interconnectedness, diseases are spreading. So the poor are more vulnerable, and the wealthy, while they may have better nutrition, if we're traveling around the world to different countries, we may be susceptible to getting diseases and illnesses that we've not had before because it may not exist in our country, or we're just not immune or familiar with it. So let's look at the history of global health. So the World Health Organization, which is what WHO is, was created after World War II as an intergovernmental agency for the purpose of leading and coordinating worldwide health activities. So along with the World Bank, they started to think globally and act locally. So in relation to the World Health Organization and globalization, as European explorers, conquerors came to the Americas, they started to spread different things such as smallpox, measles, yellow fever, and also more recently you've heard about issues with HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, SARS, West Nile. We had the Ebola scare with the doctor actually from Indiana coming into Texas with the Ebola virus. And so the World Health Organization came together after World War II and decided, we need to have more efforts directed at global health. So they started to initiate the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations, the Global Tuberculosis Partnership, and also the Global Fund on HIV/AIDS. Because what they realized as the World Health Organization is that this was going to impact everyone. It wasn't just something that was specifically based in a certain country. This was going to have an impact on everyone involved. And so the World Health Organization, and also, as I mentioned, the World Bank, whose operations began shortly after World War II as well in 1946, they were supposed to finance the European reconstruction after World War II. And what World Bank found is that there's more reconstruction than just literally rebuilding houses and communities and buildings. They found that, there was a major resource needed for health, nutrition, and also population within the developing countries. And so, as you see on the slide here, a developing country is a poor agriculture country that is seeking to become more advanced economically and socially. So, throughout the semester, as you hear us talk about developing countries, have that definition in mind. And so the World Bank is the largest financial contributor to health projects throughout the world. So they help the World Health Organization in a lot of their involvements. And then thirdly, there's a group called the Alma Ate Declaration. So this stated that governments have the responsibility for health for their people, which can be fulfilled only by the provision of adequate health and social measures. So according to this document, the Alma Ate Declaration, their main target was the governments, international organizations, and the whole world community to, in the coming decades, give all people health care, and that it would be a level of health care that would lead them to living socially and economically productive lives. So primary health care is the key to attaining this target within a development of social justice. So what most people recognized was that in order to be a successful citizen of the world, you needed to have good health in order to be productive and social. So that's why these organizations were created. And so moving from the creation of these organizations, we can look at the state of the world's population. So worldwide, a child born in 1955 had an average life expectancy at birth of 48 years. This varies between men and women. Oftentimes women would live up to 48 years, men would live up to 46 years. And so thankfully, as times have changed and due to improved living conditions, advances in medical science, and then also population level interventions, the average life expectancy had increased to at least 66 years old by 2000. Now, this is different between probably what you've heard of within the United States, where people can live up to their 80s and 90s. So these numbers are worldwide. So if past trends continue, the global life expectancy at birth is projected to rise to 73 years by 2025. So they noted that some of the largest increases in population growth will hopefully occur in Africa. So many countries are facing a shrinking pool of working individuals, so people between 15 and 64, who are needed to support the older adult population. So then, looking at the United States, the largest population growth is expected to come from immigration and the growth of older adult population for the U.S. So you can see on this slide there are some statistics in regards to low-income countries will have an increase from 55 to 57. Higher-income countries such as the United States, Europe, parts of Asia will have 78 to 80 years. And so the world's population reached 7 billion people in 2011. And so, but an important note needs to be made that women on average are having fewer children than they were in the 1960s. If you've taken the Introduction to Sociology class, you'll understand that that average has dropped because of more women working in the workplace. Women are getting married later in life. They are not wanting to have children as early in life. And so that makes a big difference between when they have children and how the world population then continues. So looking at MDGs, so you'll see this a couple different times throughout the textbooks. So MDGs are Millennium Development Goals. So these were adopted in the year 2000 and set to be achieved by 2015. And these are broadly supported, comprehensive, and specific development goals worldwide. So this was something that was created in order to take care of people across the world. So they were looking to improve on the benchmarks for things such as income, poverty, hunger, maternal and child mortality, disease and adequate shelter, gender inequality, environmental degradation, and the Global Partnership for Development. And so these were issued by the United Nations. And you'll see throughout your text it gives some details on the progress of how these were made. So you might be wondering, well, why exactly are we looking at these? Because the organizations that we looked at before, while they were making great impact, we needed to have a specific set of goals in place worldwide, because we have issues, such as mentioned before, where there's child mortality, where the life expectancy varies around the world, where some women don't live as long as men. There's issues that occur such as, tobacco use and other substance uses that cause people's lifespans to be shorter. And so it's important that these Millennium Development Goals were created in order to help prevent these things from happening throughout the world. So were the Millennium Development Goals a success? Notice I put yes, kind of. Your text talks about the 2014 goal report. So right before they were supposed to be finished and the 2015 report was given, you can see that they looked at the information in detail and found that they needed to make another set of goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals were issued to be examined in September of 2015. So if you click on the link that I've provided, you'll be able to look at the report where they've seen that, it was a success, but as with everything, there's still goals that have to be obtained. There's still things that have to be looked at and taken care of. So from looking at MDGs, we're going to look at years of life lost. So years of life lost in your text is a calculation that subtracts the average life expectancy from the actual age of death. So this is being calculated across the world and trying to determine what global health patterns are causing people to lose years of their life. So why are they dying so much earlier than what they were expected to? So that's the calculation of the years of life lost. So you see some of the leading causes listed out here on the slide, where this has another impact on the world population. So these different issues cause the population rate to shift up and down. And so some other leading causes to that in the world population challenges include migration from rural areas to urban cities, the stress that occurs on the global environment, increased demand for family planning, pregnancy and childbirth complications, a lack of prenatal care across the world, skilled birth attendants, so people who are there while someone is having a baby, they'll be hopefully delivered by a skilled birth attendant and not just, a random family member or person within the community or the tribe. And then HIV/AIDS. These are some of the major world populations that the UNFPA indicate will cause the world to struggle over time. So these different world population challenges lead us to talk about the concept of global health disparities. Okay, so a health disparity is a statistically significant difference in health indicators that persist over time. So by comparison, healthcare disparities are differences in access to appropriate healthcare services by various groups because of a multitude of factors, mainly associated with social inequalities. So we've talked about all of these different things that will happen when we calculate years of life lost and the challenges that the global population will come about. A lot of these reasons are because of global health disparities. So as I mentioned, it's the lack of resources due to a multitude of factors. So what would have a greater impact on people being able to get quality health care? Well, access to quality health care and timely health care is unequal worldwide. So think about your own daily life. If you don't feel that great, you could possibly go to an urgent care, go to an ER, make a doctor's appointment, right? There's credible, valid quality health care, you hope it's quality health care, available to you throughout your areas. Now, some rural areas you might have to travel a little farther, but for the most part, most of us are able to get to a healthcare provider as soon as possible. And this is not the case for everyone. So if you're injured out in rural Africa, you may be injured and bleeding for quite a while until either A, somebody finds you if you're alone, or B, if you have someone who's able to go get help for you, it may take them a while depending on the type of healthcare that they have available. So it's important to recognize that access to quality and timely healthcare is a global disparity. So just because, these different initiatives and goals are available, we still have to be able to provide that type of healthcare to people. So the burden of disease and brain drain is affecting some countries desperately. So what they're talking about by the burden of disease is the impact of a health problem can really have an impact financially. So mortality, morbidity, all of those cost money. When someone passes away, there are steps that need to be taken for that. And so it's really a disease burden is an effect at the national and local levels. And so the World Health Organization is looking to work on that, the global burden of disease, and shifting from infectious diseases to non-communicable diseases, and it's developing into more chronic conditions such as heart disease and stroke, which are now becoming the leading cause of death globally. And so it's impossible to predict what type of impact these burdens of disease are going to have. And so that's creating a brain drain for the World Health Organization and local individuals working with these different types of inequalities. So inequalities exist both within and among nations. So again, you noticed I said nationally and locally. So it can affect a nation as a whole, but it can also affect the local parts of those different nations. Different tribes, different cities and towns are going to be affected differently in regards to their health care. Adequate health care is a factor also in social stability and economic growth. So not only as an individual, but as a whole society, in order to have people working and reproducing and, being able to coexist within their society, we have to make sure that people have adequate health care, or we wouldn't have socially stable individuals or settings, and then we also wouldn't be able to have any type of economic growth. So that adequate health care is really important. They find that countries who don't have adequate health care often have inadequate funding, poor government organization, and inadequate access for healthcare services for all of their population. So it really is important that adequate health care exists. So looking at health disparities within the United States, a persistent gap exists between the health status of minorities and non-minorities. So you can see I've listed here some of the minorities that exist in the United States: African Americans, Hispanics, Latinos, American Indians, Alaskan Natives, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. So many of these minorities have higher rates of infant mortality, cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, HIV/AIDS, and cancer. They also have lower rates of immunizations and cancer screenings. So you might wonder, well, why in the world do we have all of this? I don't understand. If these people are within the United States, why are minorities not receiving the same type of care that everyone else does? Well, the major factor includes inadequate access to health care. So whether it be economic, geographic, or linguistic factors, there's a lack of or decrease in health insurance and education, leading to poorer qualities of health care. So many of us, taking Soc 101, you learned about different minorities and racial and ethnic groups are impacted by the different social constructions that we have in the United States within our society. So oftentimes if you're seen as a minority, you're struggling in regards to the type of schooling that you're receiving, the type of education that you're getting, if you're able to even afford health care. So that's why Obamacare was created, because individuals who maybe are unemployed would have to get Medicaid, where then you have individuals who are working low-paying jobs who may not offer insurance. So then they would need to get on something like Obamacare in order to have health insurance at a decent price. Because most of us know insurance premiums are astronomical if you're not getting it through a workplace. So if your workplace doesn't offer health insurance, how are you going to be able to get screenings for cancer, get medicine for diabetes, get care for cardiovascular diseases, and other diseases of that nature if you don't have the availability for that type of health care? And then there's also substandard quality of care, or a lower quality of care. So caused possibly by patient-provider miscommunication, provider discrimination, and stereotyping or prejudice. So again, if you've taken Social 101, we talk about race and ethnicity and unfortunate forms of prejudice and discrimination that exist in the United States, some forms of racism. While that has decreased, there are still possibilities of that being available and happening within the healthcare system. And so, if someone isn't able to provide a translator possibly, then someone may not be able to explain what exactly is wrong with them health-wise. And so that can cause miscommunication, and then also depending on the opinions and prejudice of the provider, they may or may not provide inadequate health care due to discrimination. So those are some important health disparities to look at within the United States. So some of the challenges that come with the world population growing. So while that would be great that people would live longer and grow more, and more people would grow, the global population then will have an impact on everyone worldwide. So the world's population is supposed to increase by 2.5 billion people by the time we hit 2050. And so right now the average family size is about 3 children per woman, and it declined from 6 children per woman in 1960. And so thankfully that is from family planning, where people are available to get birth control information about reproducing during their cycle, the best times to and to not have intercourse to make a baby. And so that led to countries with decreasing birth rates expected to have an increased aging population. So it's kind of like a catch-22. It's like, oh, this is great. Women are more in control, women and men are more in control of their family planning. They have help, in order to maybe stack it out where they have, one kid, 3 years apart, another one 2 years apart. But with this family planning, then that causes an increased aging population. Not having as many babies born then has the population caused to be older and get aging without having that younger generation available to help take care of the aging population. So developing countries will comprise 96% of the population. The population in Europe and Japan is actually expected to decrease, and the U.S. population is expected to only increase about 1% related to immigration. So individuals coming from around the world to come live in the United States. And so if you want to look at more information in regards to population, birth control efforts, violence against women, you can take a look at the UNFPA website, so United Nations Population Fund, and that can provide you a bit more information in regards to those specific outlets of world population growth. We were discussing adequate health care earlier, and what exactly does that mean for a country to have an adequate healthcare system and be able to have good health for their individuals? So it's important that an adequate healthcare system should have or be equitable access to quality care in the forms of both prevention and treatment services for rural and urban populations. So it should be equal between whatever population you are a part of. It shouldn't be separate just because you're a part of the rural community or the urban community. Second, affordability, which means that even if people have no income or health insurance, they should be able to receive services. This is a big argument within the United States specifically of should the government provide health care for everyone, or is it something that we should just make individuals earn, whether it be through their workplace or if they apply for government assistance? And thirdly, sustainability, which means that the system has a long-term political and financial support. So it doesn't help individuals to get good health and have adequate health care if it's not sustainable, if there's not enough funding available for individuals to be able to receive that type of good health care. So good health indicators should include definition, validity, feasibility, and utility. So all of these things have an impact on that adequate healthcare system. It provides estimates of a country's state of health. It may reflect either direct or indirect measurements of a health phenomenon. And then few developing countries, though, are able to measure their health statistics accurately. So some of them aren't able to provide a definition or validity or the feasibility or that utility in regards to their health statistics. So some developing countries may ask for assistance from other countries in order to come up with these good health indicators and measure those statistics for them. So, in speaking of everyone being able to have adequate health care, in 1948, the Universal Right to Health Care was created, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this was unanimously accepted by the United Nations General Assembly as a common standard for the entire world's population. So specifically, it states that a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including medical care and the right to security in the event of sickness, disability, and other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. That every person should have that right. So you'll notice in yellow here I've marked that the United States is currently the only developed country in the world that does not have a plan for universal health care coverage and some type of legal right to health care for all of its residents. So there are individuals out there who do not have health insurance. They're not able to either afford it or be able to obtain it from an employer, and unfortunately the U.S. is, as it says, one of the only developed countries that doesn't have that availability of universal health care for individuals. So some major emerging threats that are coming about within global health include infectious diseases. So there's still the issue of HIV, Ebola virus, tuberculosis, and malaria. There's also antibiotic resistance bacteria and viruses that are not being impacted by antibiotics. So if anybody gets the flu shot, oftentimes you may get the flu shot and then you may still get the flu because there's a different strain of flu virus that was created or has been formed from other flu viruses, and so there's that antibiotic resistance from that. Unintentional injuries due to automobile and workplace accidents, there's war and street violence, domestic violence, there's still mental health issues, tobacco use, which has decreased, at least in the United States, but it still exists around the world, and then also urban air pollution. So that's a big issue in a lot of different countries who are developing countries but don't necessarily have the best air quality available for their individuals. So they thought it was important then to look at the moral issues within global health. So the creation of global health initiatives has to also look at the ethical and moral values that come from helping individuals with their health and their health care. So some global initiatives were created, such as humanitarianism, which is acting virtuosely towards those in need. It is often a response to social problems. It's incorporated with all religions and is really based on compassion. So there's a lot of humanitarian efforts in regards to when we have natural disasters across the world, and so that's an important thing to look at in global health. Then you have utilitarianism, which is maximizing happiness for many people. So really improving the health of individuals living within a specific society is in the best interest for all people in society. So what good does it do society if people are sick and unhealthy and unhappy? Okay, so utilitarianism looks at that happiness and then how we can relate it to health. Equity by achieving a fair distribution of health capabilities. So again, ensuring that all people in society have a fair and equal chance to achieve good health. So are we able to have some low income health facilities available? Are different sites like Planned Parenthood, who provide things for a cheaper aspect, those may be considered part of this moral issue of that equity of achieving a fair distribution of health capabilities. It doesn't matter what your income is. If you have insurance, you'll get health care. Having the rights, so fulfilling the obligations so that people are dignified, ensures that healthcare respects human rights and dignity for all people living in society. So as a student at Marian University, one of the Franciscan values is dignity of the individual. And so that's definitely something that within global health as a moral issue we would want to look at. Then also knowledge and institutions. So the support for research and development of new health technologies and medications. So, Marian has the second med school in the state of Indiana. So we're a part of that knowledge and institutional development in order to, help make drugs more affordable, work with corporations who, have huge profits from producing and selling the drugs, but however, we need to look at the details of the cost of development, the use of resources, and utilizing that knowledge in order to make the best products that we're able to, and also provide the best health care that we can. And then lastly, a consensus and of advocacy groups. So people who are usually in powerful political positions who wish to have health policies established for others in society. We need advocacy groups. We oftentimes need people who have that political and sometimes financial access that other people in the world don't. It's kind of like speaking for the little guy, providing that voice for them that they've needed, that they're not able to give themselves. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to Chapter 5. So Chapter 5 is about the pandemic of modern slavery, human trafficking. So the reason I wanted to look at this chapter is because it is an important topic that is happening around the world, but also here within the state of Indiana and also, in the United States. And so human trafficking is defined as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the use of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, abduction of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Now, that's a pretty long definition, but it really does give the details of what human trafficking is and what it involves. And so your text talks about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that was passed in the United States in the year 2000, which adopted the UN definition and extended special protection to foreigners who were trafficked into the United States. So oftentimes individuals are trafficked from one country to another. And so it's important to understand that the definition includes a variety of activities for which people can be prosecuted for. And so this can happen from people coming from India or Thailand into the United States and vice versa. And so this Trafficking Victims Protection Act exists because of this large definition and how there's a lot of different ways that people could be charged in regards to human trafficking. So you can see on the picture that National Human Trafficking Awareness Day is January 11th. So let's look at some of the differences in human trafficking. So there are forced labor, sex trafficking, organ trafficking, baby trafficking, debt bondage, child brides, and child soldiers. So unfortunately, a lot of people just think that human trafficking is sex trafficking, and that is not the case. So we're going to go through each one of these because I think it's important for us to be aware of the different types of trafficking and ways possibly that you could recognize if there's a trafficking situation going on in your neighborhood or around you or in your workplace. So the first one is forced labor. So this is really prevalent in many parts of the world. Workers are often brought from other countries to work, and then they end up being treated as slaves. So sometimes workers owe an increasing amount of debt. So it can depend on whether they're needing to pay off the debt or if they've been tricked into thinking it's a job. So there's a story of one woman who thought she was going to be a painter. She was going to get money. She was a single mom, and she was going to this other country to do some painting work, and they ended up basically making her do other things, so in regards to forced labor. So she thought she was going to do one job, and they ended up making her do another job. So some examples are fishing in Thailand, brick making in India and Afghanistan, and also chocolate production in Western Africa, Asia, and South America. So instead of, hiring individuals to do these different jobs or working with them to pay off their debt, they just force them to do this type of labor without really any pay other than their life, essentially. The next one is sex trafficking. So victims are forced into sex trafficking. Most victims are men, women, and children. So it's important to note that I put men in there because oftentimes it's overlooked that it's just women and children, but men are also being sex trafficked. In some countries, parents will sell their children to obtain money for the family. So they will literally get involved with a trafficking ring, either to then pay off debt or to get some type of money in exchange for their child. And that's how they go about the business. In the United States, the commercial sexual exploitation of children is referred to as domestic minor sex trafficking. So if you ever see an article that talks about DMST, that's domestic minor sex trafficking. An interesting one that a lot of people don't know about is organ trafficking. So organ trafficking can be voluntary or involuntary. Sometimes poor individuals are more likely to be conned into this type of organ trafficking idea. There's usually long waiting lists for organs, which cause an increased demand. And sometimes infants, young children, and some adults are most vulnerable. So part of that involuntary organ donation is the kidnapping of an individual's for the removal of organs. So no attention is given to sanitation. The surgeons are poorly trained, if they're even surgeons, and sometimes victims tend not to survive. So sometimes people will be kidnapped just for that, or so I had my gallbladder removed a couple years ago. If you've ever thought about it, we're basically putting the trust in the hands of these individuals to take out the proper organ and, not do anything else while they're in there. And so I bring that up because I find it fascinating that, okay, going in to take out my gallbladder, what if they took out my pancreas and I don't know it? Okay, so that could be involuntary. Infants. Sometimes when infants are born in some of these countries, they will take the infant and say, oh, we've got to do some tests or we've got to do something else on them. And they'll literally take out organs from the baby. And they'll con basically the poor individuals to say, oh, your baby had this type of health condition. And so it's really unfortunate that this happens in different countries where, organs are taken from people, people are kidnapped specifically for organs to be taken from them for money. Next, we have baby trafficking and debt bondage. So baby trafficking, most of us have heard of the black market. There's black market adoptions. Sometimes this is where infants' organs are sold or the babies themselves are sold. And it's really used as leverage against the mothers. So it possibly could be a father that kidnaps the child and then sells them on the black market, or the mother themselves, again, similar to selling off your child, may need to pay off a debt, and so they will have that leverage against the mother in order for them to pay off their debt. Similar to that is debt bondage, where it's the continuous enslavement of victims. So the debt continues to increase, and they're forced to work off their debt against their will. So the debt could be any type of debt. It usually has to do with, arranging for their jobs, transportation, living accommodations, daily expenses. And so it's common for traffickers to tell victims that, oh, your job for travel costs too much, so now your debt has increased. You got to pay it off. And then, it just keeps building and building and building. So they're never able to get out of debt, basically. They just continue being enslaved by them. Next is child brides. So similar to instead of just selling off the children, this is when they enter into involuntary marriages, mostly through specific cultural traditions. So once they're married, then they're treated as sex slaves, housekeepers, and mothers for the heirs for their husbands. So this isn't, I don't want you to get this confused with arranged marriages. So at least oftentimes arranged marriages, there's an agreement between the two families in regards to the two people getting married, where these aren't generally voluntary. Being a part of an arranged marriage is still being voluntary within your specific culture, but you're also treated differently once you are married. You're not then going to be used as a sex slave or only a housekeeper, and you have nothing else that you're able to do. And so that is a difference between the child brides and arranged marriages. And then also with child brides, the age can vary. So they may not even be old enough to rear children yet, and so they'll then have to wait until they can actually have children, but the family will still marry them off as a child bride. So their lives are usually characterized by hard work and, as I mentioned, child rearing, and usually they are uneducated and oftentimes prohibited from activities that they may choose. So unlike in a arranged marriage where, the bride and groom will do things together and they have, more freedom, these people are really enslaved within the marriage. So they're not able to do certain activities. They may never leave their home. And so oftentimes then they are uneducated as well. And then we have child soldiers. So child soldiers are any child under the age of 18 who is forced to participate in armed conflict, even as cooks or messengers. So this is not like individuals in the United States who join the army, who voluntarily decide to enlist. These children are often put into guerrilla armies and are being kidnapped from their villages. They're oftentimes forced by leaders upon the threat of their own deaths if they don't join. So this is quite a bit different than what we are used to hearing. So we want to look at those who human traffic. So not the ones being trafficked, but the ones who do the actual trafficking. So oftentimes stereotypes of people who are involved in human trafficking are young males in outlandish attire. They have expensive vehicles, like they're rolling up in the Denali, Suburban or limo. Usually stereotyped as African Americans found in inner city neighborhoods. But you can see on the right-hand side, the real human trafficker could be a male or a female. They could be seen at any age, and they are excellent profilers and con artists. So they're able to coerce individuals into kidnapping them, having them come with them. So that's part of their job. Women traffickers is actually a growing trend. They're seen as less threatening to potential victims, and they don't fit the trafficker stereotype. So they're able to get more victims to join them and to be a part of the trafficking ring. Sometimes those women traffickers have basically moved up in a way from being a victim to then working as a part of the ring. Potential victims of human trafficking include women and children of both sexes, young girls seeking to find a better life. So unfortunately, if they're in a country where they're unhappy, maybe uneducated, they just don't feel like that they are making a way within their life, they'll get sucked into a human trafficking ring by being promised of a better life. So sometimes those human traffickers will coerce young girls into saying, oh, come with me and I can pay for your education. I can give you a better life in this other country. So oftentimes these individuals could be runaways. They can be men in poorer countries who are looking to make an income. And then oftentimes vulnerable populations are trafficked, such as deaf children and transgendered children, who sometimes could be runaways as well. So looking at the health of sex trafficking survivors. So victims are prone to sexually transmitted diseases. Unfortunately, oftentimes, especially the sex traffickers are not provided condoms, they're not provided adequate health care, they're not provided adequate testing or vaccinations. Sometimes they're deprived of food, water, and sleep. They're often beaten by the pimps or customers, so oftentimes they may be beaten as soon as they are brought into the trafficking ring. One of the pimps will, beat them, sexually abuse them, and what that does is it basically breaks them. So it breaks the individual from who they were, and they kind of strip them of their identity and self-worth, and then they send them out to customers. So basically they don't think of themselves, they just do their job. Because of that, then they're likely to suffer from mental illnesses and drug abuse, because once they've been broken by that pimp or customers, then, how do they deal with the situation that they're in? They didn't expect to be in this place. What do they do? And so they start to suffer from different mental illness. They may use drugs and alcohol to numb the pain. So they receive medical care only when absolutely necessary. And sometimes that's not usually sanitized healthcare or by a professional who is trained. Also, if a sex trafficking victim gets pregnant, they're required to get an abortion, and Lord knows if that is sanitized or if that's done by a professional as well. There's an organization called the Polaris Project who provides red flags to raise awareness for sex trafficking. So that includes if you are around an individual who's disoriented, they have a lack of financial control, they don't have proper identification. So a lot of individuals who are trafficked in one way or another, whether it be sex trafficked or into forced labor, are stripped of their IDs. So they don't have a visa, a passport, a driver's license. So it's very difficult to identify them. They also have a lack of personal freedom, such as always having someone with him or her. Sometimes that's a pimp, sometimes that's one of the pimp's workers, who kind of follows the girls around, makes the discussions in regards to who they can go with and who they can't go with. So the Polaris Project, if you go to polarisproject.org, has a lot of information in order to, find out and recognize if you think someone is a part of a trafficking situation. These give you some more red flags in looking into their situation. So oftentimes treatment constraints, I mentioned some of these before. Trafficking victims don't have control over their own bodies, time, and money. They can't complete antibiotic courses or abstain from sex to prevent the spread of STDs. Like I said, cannot use condoms unless it's okay with the pimp or customer, often not allowed to prevent pregnancies, and pregnancies sometimes are used to control the victim. So some interventions that have been created, Georgia was the first state to develop a statewide response to that domestic minor sex trafficking using a team effort approach. So the first priority was to establish safety through safe houses and shelters. So similar to homeless shelters, domestic violence shelters, these different shelters are existing, or they're even putting them within domestic violence shelters and homeless shelters in order for victims to try and escape and get to a safe house and a shelter and to move on from there. Survivors then evaluated for other needs, so they're able to determine if they need new identification, if they need health care. So Trafficking in Persons lists phone numbers and resources for survivors that are there. So the basic medical care cost to treat one human trafficking survivor is $30,000. So if anybody is really, worried about the cost and what this is costing human trafficking survivors, or what it's costing, the United States and the world, by allowing this to happen, once we are able to get someone out of that situation and help them become a survivor instead of a victim, it's $30,000 in medical care to treat them, whether it be mental illnesses, potentially sexual transmitted diseases, or if they were pregnant when they escaped and got to the safe house. So I find that that's an interesting statistic that really kind of makes it sink in for a lot of people in looking at global health financially. So I will have a documentary posted for you that you guys either should have watched before you listen to the lecture or afterwards, and it has to do with human trafficking, and I feel like it gives a great behind-the-scenes look at more specifically sex trafficking and how a group was trying to prevent that from happening. So I hope everybody has a great week.